I'm Julia Koerner, and I'm an architect and designer and work between fashion, product design, and architecture. And I'm an assistant adjunct professor at UCLA in the Architecture and Urban Design department, where I'm also the director of the summer programs. I studied at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna and later on at the Architectural Association in London, always with a deep interest in emergent technologies and design. And I was looking into digital fabrication, specifically 3D printing and additive manufacturing. And I was always inspired by natural environments and biology and the human body. And for me, the human body is kind of my site where I can work in a way like the second skin and develop architectural geometries on a very small scale. It's kind of designing a second skin of the human body. And I was drawn to working within product design through several different collaborations, which I did in the past, and kind of figured out that fashion design is a really interesting scale to apply the contemporary computational design processes, because the technology is so advanced that you can actually realize the ideas which we create in the computer in a very fast pace on a small scale. It's like in architecture we use 3D printing for prototyping, and in fashion the prototyping can become actually manufacturing. And I thought this was really interesting, and that's how I got more and more involved in fashion design, product design, and also costume design. I am originally from Salzburg in Austria, and I have studied in Vienna, and in London I've worked a little bit in New York, and since 2012 I'm in Los Angeles. I think my home today is between Austria and the United States. I travel actually a lot between Los Angeles and Vienna, and I have studios and ateliers in both places, and I work between Europe and the US. And professionally, that allows me to collaborate with other brands which are on an international scale. So for me and my work, it's really important to work between those two different cultures. So I wouldn't necessarily see only Los Angeles as the place to be, because I think this kind of exchange between the two, and I think there's a very strong relationship between Los Angeles and Vienna, has always been, both architecturally and culturally, because there's a lot of Viennese architects who came to Los Angeles and vice versa. And for me, this kind of exchange had always a similar kind of excitement. So when I go to Austria, I miss LA, and when I'm in LA, I miss Austria. And I kind of also combine these different ideas. What I really like about Los Angeles is the openness of people, the kind of diversity of people, what you find, the diversity in art, science, and technology, and the kind of openness for new ideas. When you go to Austria, what I like about it is it's embedded in the cultural history of Europe, and it has a lot of old cultural buildings, a lot of historic buildings, a lot of historic art. I like to go and visit, when I collaborate with brands there, I like to go and visit the archives and see hundreds of years of traditional craftsmanship, which then inspire me to work and implement novel technologies, such as, for example, a recent collaboration with Swarovski, which is a more than 100 years old company. Their headquarters is actually in Austria, and they're an international brand. But the kind of heritage of it was so important throughout the collaboration with them. And I really always look into this kind of traditional craftsmanship and how can it translate with novel and innovative new technologies. And I think that this kind of axis between there's a lot of things to learn from these kind of cultural methods of creating things, the culture of having conversations, or the culture of discourse. And so for me, I really see myself between those two places. I think that Vienna is a really interesting spot because it's situated as a rather on the eastern side of the European Union. And so the city has a lot of influences from East Europe. But it was always the center of the old Austrian Empire, right? And so it has so much history in architecture. It has so much history in art. Like, it's really the cultural history, which is so much embedded there. And also, if you look at the city, it has like all the Art Nouveau buildings. It has Joseph Hoffmann and Otto Wagner, the Secession. It has a lot of really important architectural buildings, Adolf Loos, and the kind of non-ornamental buildings, equally as the Baroque buildings and the Gothic buildings, which you find there. Like, there's so many different times and important architectural styles just in one city. And then at the same time, it also, I think the Austrians have always a kind of tendency to work very cutting edge and like think outside of the box. So there has been also a lot of contemporary architecture, such as Peter Cook building, there's Zaha Hadid, there's a Jean Nouvel building. There's like a lot of contemporary important architects have built in the city of Vienna. And I think that kind of makes it relevant on many different aspects. And also in a city, kind of on an urban development is similar. There is, when you would be surprised how many companies actually are located in Austria and how many ideas are coming from there, where in everyday life we wouldn't actually assume that. It's very interesting. Greg Lynn has been teaching at the Angewandte since the early 2000s, and he's still teaching there. And I think this kind of influence of Los Angeles and Vienna in many other aspects. Wolf Pricks, yes. Then there's Mark Mack also, who has taught at UCLA for a really long time. And there was Peter Növer also, between the Mack Schindler House in West Hollywood. I think that Tom Viscom used to work in Vienna with Wolf Pricks, and but also in the kind of art scene and in the photographers, there are many Austrian photographers here in Los Angeles, many Austrian artists who live and work here, and there is architects too. I think the axis is in the contemporary time, but also in the old time. Rudolf Schindler came from Austria, then Richard Neutra came from Austria, and so it's like all these kind of people there was always a strong connection between the two countries. I came to the United States through the Max Schindler Scholarship at first. That was in 2010-11. I was selected to live here in Los Angeles for 6 months and explore the biodiversity of California. And that gave me an opportunity to get to know Los Angeles. I had worked before already in New York, and I kind of explored the East Coast, but 2010 was the first time I actually spent more time here in Los Angeles. And then I decided while I was here that I actually would like to go and do another master at the Architectural Association in Emergent Technologies and Design, because I felt really drawn to studying the kind of mathematical logics of this biodiversity, like all the reliefs I found, all the patterns between the desert and the ocean. I wanted to understand that more. And I knew that at the MTech program at the AA, they were focusing on how do you script such formulas, how do you create algorithms which can look into biomimicry and mimic these kind of biological systems. And I was really drawn to that. And then I went back to London. I studied there for 1 year, and I met my partner there, who I work with today as well. And then afterwards, I got this opportunity to come to Los Angeles. So I got the opportunity to come to Los Angeles in 2012 to teach at UCLA, and I teach mainly in the graduate program there. So the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, also called die Angewandte, is a school which is focused on the applied arts. So it is one of 3 architectural schools in Vienna. One is the University of Technology, the other one is the Academy of Fine Arts, and at all 3 places you can study architecture. The Angewandte is a very unique school because when I studied there, it was still set up as the old Meisterklassen system. The Meisterklassen system is that you study for 5 years with an architect and you become a prodigy of that architect. You really encapsulate every single detail. And imagine just 5 years studying with Greg Lynn. It's fascinating and at the same time overwhelming if I think of it. At the same time, when I was studying at the Angewandte, there was also Zaha Hadid and Wolf Prix teaching there. So they had 3 architecture professors, and they each had their studio. So for 5 years, I was there. I was actually there for 4 years because I had studied at the University of Technology before. But for these 4 years, I experienced Wolf Prix, Zaha Hadid, and Greg Lynn simultaneously on an everyday basis. On top of that, they had other majors there. So they had ceramics, they had product design, they had film, media arts, fashion design. They had all kinds of different artistic majors. And so Greg Lynn's studio was between product design and fashion design, which maybe adds another kind of level of insight into my work approach. Is when we were students with Greg Lynn, we were asked to design a pavilion for Red Bull, and we didn't know how to sew anything. So we went up to the fashion designers and they helped us with sewing our tensile structures for the Red Bull pavilion. While the fashion designers wanted to have CNC milled shoes, and they didn't know how to create computer models or run the CNC, so they came to us architects to design those shoes for them. And this kind of idea of cross-bridging between different disciplines for sure shaped my kind of career in a very early stage. And it's the people who taught there who made and shaped really the school. I mean, even in fashion design, Raf Simons and Hussein Shalayan and all these kind of really important people in media arts and in product design. Ross Lovegrove had taught there as well. They all kind of shaped the school, and it was a kind of also unique experience because the education is for free. So you study there and you pay like a minimal student fee, but essentially higher education is for free. And that was an amazing experience to study with so famous architects in a free educational environment. And that it wasn't easy to get into the school because they have, they call it like a application week where they kind of look at, they select the students who applies there. And when I was studying there, they also had something called like an Aufnahmeprüfung, like you had to go and you had to make like an exam in order an entry exam to be allowed. And I remember I was one of 6 students who was admitted to Greg Lynn's studio in my year. So it's very, very small studios. And then they have something which is called vertical studio. So you actually enter university and you study with all the other years. That means I did a project at the same time as somebody who was already in his 5th year. And so I could always look how they did it. And so there was a lot of knowledge transfer. And I wouldn't just be like with all other students starting at the same time with me, but I could actually look and start to understand, and I could go up to the people who had studied there already for a while, learn the software from them. I stayed basically day and night at that school, and I took so much advantage from all the people I met there, all the friends and all the colleagues I met there. And I think it's really, when you think about it, it's really the other people who you learn from. That's the same at the AA. It was equally like the people who I met at AA are some of my best friends today and who have been always long time in touch. And it's kind of, you build like a network also. So I learned a lot from all the people I studied with. My mentors are very diverse. I think my biggest mentors were probably my grandmother, my grandfather, and my parents, because they all came from different backgrounds. My grandmother, she was a seamstress, so she was working in the fashion design. My grandfather was an engineer, and he was very much involved in technological aspects. My father is a professor in arts and crafts. And so from him, I kind of got this insight into architecture and art and design. And my mother, she's a biologist, and which brings the kind of natural environment into my whole work. And I'm also, I think this is kind of from my family side, my mentors. On a professional end, my mentors definitely were Greg Lynn, who I was studying with in Vienna, Ross Lovegrove, who I worked with in London in the kind of more industrial design world. And then I think there are people who daily inspire me. One of them is my partner and husband, Kaisal Ravi, who I work with since almost 10 years. And we kind of exchange and mentor each other on a daily basis. And certainly also my brother, who is also an architect. He is doing his PhD at the University of Innsbruck. And he teaches at the Bartlett University. And we have a lot of exchange about teaching methodologies between different schools and different continents. And kind of also his focus a lot on academia and my focus more on the professional world. I think that we constantly exchange our ideas. Ross is really such an amazing person, both on a kind of designer mind, but also philosophically, like how he approaches how we should like entirely rethink what design is and how we create objects in this world. My husband and I, when we run the AI visiting school in Jordan, he's the director of it, we invited Ross Lovegrove for a kind of presentation, and he came to Jordan. We went to the Wadi Rum in the desert, and Ross gave a lecture for about 3 hours under the stars in the middle of nowhere in the Wadi Rum. It was amazing, and it was just so, yeah, I think he has a way of thinking about design and aesthetics in such a different way. So I really learned a lot from him. One thing what I remember is that Greg Lynn used to say, when I was a student of him in Vienna, he used to say, "We are teaching you what will be relevant within 10 years. And I never really understood what that meant. I know what it meant now, because when I studied architecture, I had no clue that, or I had no idea that I would ever be able to work in the kind of professional world where I work now, collaborating with high-end fashion houses in Paris, collaborating with the Hollywood industry, like really implementing my kind of architectural processes into another discipline eventually, and also disrupting other industries. I think that one thing what I definitely learned is that I always was interested in fashion. I even wanted to study fashion, but I know today that I would have never designed fashion pieces in the way I'm doing it today if I would have studied traditional fashion design. It's really the architectural mindset and the kind of three-dimensional design expertise and the computational design expertise with the relationship to the emergent technologies, which allow me to do the work today. My path into working with 3D printing technology was very interesting because I actually started studying at the University of Technology in Vienna, and with a lot of students. It was like a really vibrant university with a lot of beginning students. And I had a very big interest in the more artistic approach towards architecture and the more kind of art and design of architecture. And so after about 3 years, I decided to go to the Angewandte, the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, to study with Greg Lynn. I had seen Greg Lynn's embryological house at an exhibition, and I had many friends who studied at the Angewandte, and so I really wanted to also study with Greg Lynn. And at that time, it was around 2005 when I started at the Angewandte. It was the time when the school had just received their first 3D printer. And no one really knew how to work with this machine. And it was really exciting because, I mean, it was a very expensive technology. So I literally poured all of the money I had at that time into 3D printing models. I thought it was so exciting because it allowed me to create all these really interesting and intricate forms in the computer, but then print them out and make them tangible. And what I thought was really interesting was the translation between the physical and the digital, because you have always a loss of information. And this kind of back and forth process between the digital and the physical, I developed kind of a strategy and a back and forth process, which also kind of made its way into my thesis at the Angewandte. I looked into a lot, I researched a lot of biomechatronic research. So my thesis was about the Biomechatronic Research Center in New York, in Manhattan, where I envisioned a space which features space for prosthetics, so where people can go and buy prosthetics and can have them customized and see the design process, but also the customization towards their body. And then also it has training facility where you can start training when you get these prosthetics. And the idea about the thesis was to focus on the paradigm change. Around that time, I saw a TED Talk by Amy Mullins, a supermodel who was an amputee, and she kind of looked into the superhuman enticement of the qualities what you can get. And that became the topic of my thesis at the Angewandte. And it also led me to start looking more into the human anatomy, the body, and the smaller scale applications and the features and amateurs, what you can design around the body. And I developed these kind of ideas further after I graduated from the Angewandte. I worked for a few years with Ross Lovegrove, an industrial designer based in London, where I worked with Ross together and collaborated on how can you implement the architectural design process into the product design processes, which are very different in the design approach, not only by the means of the software what you work with, but also the materials you work with, and the speed on how you develop a product is very different than the one of an architect. So like an architect has a very different approach to ideas about the product. And Ross was very interested in that and kind of was always curious, how would I approach a project and how would I design it in the computer from an architectural perspective. And that really lent itself to a lot of product design developments I was involved in within the studio with Ross. And it also showed me that we can actually utilize the additive manufacturing to produce products right away, and we don't necessarily only need to use it to make models. Back then, it was a very far idea to think that architecture would ever be 3D printed. Today, this is different. Today, we have machines and technology available which already can 3D print on a large scale. What I think what's the difference is that while we can already 3D print on a larger scale within architecture, I yet haven't seen designs and approaches which showcase the intricacy, what we can realize on a smaller scale. And that's what I'm specifically really interested to look into more in my own research. Like, how can I scale up some of these processes I have developed in the smaller scale, and how can I implement them in the ideas for a larger scale on an architectural scale? It was in fact the way that I decided to found JK Design when I had a very important project in Paris. I always did a lot of projects under my name, and that was perfectly fine. And I think even started to, give presentations and talks and kind of did professional work. But the moment I decided I wanted to really make what I was doing on a professional level was in 2015, where I founded JK Design. And I founded it in Austria because it was very important to be kind of related to within the European Union. And I was really, I thought that founding it in Vienna, I thought like founding it in Austria was important because it was so well connected to all the other places. We also founded a company this year in Los Angeles, JK LA, and a brand JK 3D, under which we are kind of looking into more commercializing some of the ideas and developing products, and specifically in fashion design and in product design, which are then direct-to-consumer fabrication. So right now we are developing design ideas which can be both designed in-house, fabricated in-house, and sold directly to the consumer on demand. So kind of rethinking how products are traditionally developed in many different places. What that allows us is to eliminate shipping footprint, because if you have a digital design, you can eventually, wherever you have a machine, 3D print it on location, on demand. And so you don't have to produce in advance anymore. You can really produce on location. One interesting idea about that is also the production with biodegradable materials and plant-based materials. Our studio is solar powered, and we kind of have this ambition and idea to produce products which are not only sustainable but have an aesthetic which is relating to this kind of architectural innovation we're which I think, I would say, it is very hard to realize some of the ideas on the cutting edge which we work on a large scale, because due to like costs or materials or production and so on. And I really feel that in this kind of smaller scale, I get actually a lot of projects and I get a lot of work which then funds my research in a way. And that is really one of the reasons why I focus a lot on the smaller scale. Especially in the last few years, I'm like more and more realizing the capacity and power of utilizing these ideas for myself. It was always a question of, I would say, budget, because 3D printing is a very expensive technology, and a lot of the designs what I did were meant for haute couture and museums, and not necessarily for me to use. But I have designed this clutch recently, which is the high clutch, and this is really, I would say, a product which I specifically designed so that I can also wear it. And I the past summer I was wearing it almost every day, and I really like it, and I kind of realize what the potential with this kind of creations is, and how we can the moment we are able to create this in series, how we can make it more affordable and also more accessible for other people, and including myself. And I think that's a lot of, I would say, I have designed a lot of things not for me to wear, but to surround myself with. So I love keeping every single prototype I make, and I kind of have, I think of my place in Vienna, I think of like a museum of interesting artifacts, and whenever I design something, I always kept all the prototypes. I even have still my physical models from university at the Angewandte, and I think that it's just they inspire me, and I like to surround myself with them, and hopefully one day I can build a house which kind of is for me to inhabit, and where I have all these like objects around me. On one day I teach at UCLA, the other day I produce my own research, and the next day I'm collaborating with another fashion or costume designer on the next Hollywood movie. So it's very, very diverse, and I like the diversity of this because the conversations with my students inspire me and take me out of the seriousness of the reality, and in a way they allow me to innovate and spin ideas. In my research, I think that, let's say, when I work with other brands and other designers, those ideas always have a very limited time frame, because especially in the fashion industry and in the costume industry, projects have a very fast turnaround time. And so I don't get the time to explore a lot of material research or explore new properties of textiles or materials which I can implement, or even digital design processes and workflows. And I think that therefore those more commercial projects then fund my research, where I can then explore on my own time over several years how to develop new workflows, new processes, new materials, and so forth. So it's really this exchange between research and commercial professional work which push the work further. And I think I wouldn't want to do one or the other. It's really this kind of exchange which really fascinates me. And I also have days where I just go to the beach in Playa del Rey and hang out or like meet friends. And I think that one thing, what is a misperception, is that we designers, we do work a lot. And we architects especially, we have like such a hard-working work ethic. But then I think it is very important that to have also time where you don't do anything. And often I need to do a whole day nothing in order to then have an idea which just comes in 5 minutes, and then I realize it in a very short period of time. So it's this definitely not like a 9-to-5 job, which sometimes I work while I dream. Sometimes I work while I am in the shower. Sometimes my brain just keeps on going and comes up with these ideas, for example, when I wake up in the morning. And then I have to immediately run to my studio and kind of realize it or draw it or sketch it out. And that's how I work with projects too. Sometimes there are projects coming along which I'm getting really excited and I realize them in like 2 or 3 days. With other projects, I kind of push them and push them and push them, and then one day I get an idea and then I work on it. So it's very different in different scenarios. But one thing what I think is very unique about the workflow what I have is that I do a lot of projects at the same time. So I might be working on a gallery project at the same time as developing a new customized high-end fashion couture piece for Paris Fashion Week, and at the same time teach my students how to analyze plants for a new arboretum or for a new kind of power plant station or like some kind of architectural design ideas. Very different scales, but I very much enjoyed it. And maybe to talk a bit more about what I teach at UCLA, but I was teaching with Greg Lynn for 4 years the Super Studio at Ideas, which was a post-professional degree where we worked a lot with robots. I'm sure he's going to tell you more about that. But in the last 5 years, I've been mainly teaching graduate studios, so design, and I also teach a lot of classes on computational design. So we look into, for example, complex wooden joinery assembly as an introductory computational design class, and then also teach a lot of generative techniques. And I always have a few students who I do independent studies with, where I work with the robotics lab at UCLA, where we looked into 3D printing with clay, robotic timber assembly, and robotic concrete casting, where we write research papers about the processes and then present them at conferences. I think one project which definitely changed a lot in my practice and my work was the Black Panther film for Marvel, where I collaborated with Ruth Carter on the costumes. And the reason why it had such an impact on the work I do is because I all in a sudden realized how broad of an audience the film reached and what kind of impact it had on the Black community, especially here in the US, and how we as designers were able to visualize a cultural space which tells a different story. To have all in a sudden small Black girls look up to Black superwomen and princesses in this film allowed me to kind of realize how you can, through storytelling and through design especially, can elevate certain aspects. And so what I really learned with this film was that the kind of impact the costumes had redesigned with the 3D printing aesthetics kind of elevated the regal attire of the actress and created a lot of attention towards it. And I think empowering also colleagues and collaborators like Ruth Carter, who was awarded an Oscar for Best Costume Design as the first female African-American woman in this category, was a really amazing kind of experience to kind of go through with her. Like, I think that, yeah, it was the first film I ever worked on, and I had no experience with films from before, and so it was also very, I would say, certainly a challenging experience, because you kind of, it's like jumping into cold water. You don't know what to expect, and it turned out pretty good. Well, both of my parents are professors, so I come from an educational family and from an academic family, and I started teaching while I was actually a student at the AA. So I started to do small workshops in Lund in Sweden, and I also did some workshops with the Architectural Association visiting school programs, such as the visiting school in Paris or in Jordan. And so I got to kind of experience different cultures and educational environments. I also taught the postgraduate program with Hernan Diaz Alonso at the Angewandte, and then after the AA, I really wanted to go back to Vienna to teach there, but I had the opportunity to come to LA and teach with Greg Lynn, and taught with him the first 4 years in the post-professional degree at our satellite campus at UCLA, where we did a lot of work with robotic research. We had industry partners from Boeing and Cirque du Soleil, and explored kind of the implementation of architectural design concepts with those industry partners. And then I I really liked UCLA and I wanted to teach more there. So I started teaching in the graduate program and have been at UCLA since 2012 and have taught undergraduate, graduate students and postgraduate students. And I focus a lot on design studios and kind of idea building and creation with a strong focus on digital fabrication. So in a lot of the courses, I teach the students computational design techniques, digital fabrication techniques, but also how those relate to having ideas about designs and buildings. I also teach a course which is called Advanced Building Construction, where I take the students around Los Angeles and show them contemporary construction sites. They get insights with specialists from the industry, maybe in facade engineering or in kind of special materials or robotic engineering or kind of more sustainable and environmental ideas about construction. And I really like this class because it's less focused on traditional construction methods, but more thinking what's beyond and how can we think beyond traditional construction techniques and how can we rethink how we build. Like, I think in today's time where we all become more aware of our resources on this planet, we have to really start rethinking what materials we use, where do the materials come from, how are they being used, how are they being recycled, what life cycle they have, and what kind of footprint our industry has on the environment as well. For quite some time I had, I would say like 2 or 3 topics which were really interesting for me in teaching. So one of them was 3-dimensional joinery from timber construction. So looking with the students into complex timber assemblies and utilizing joineries without any glue or screws. So how can you make joints which can just be assembled and taken apart to be reconfigured? And I developed that both in an introductory design course, but then also in independent studies where we looked into robotic timber assembly. So what kind of role could the robot take in assembling traditional timber slats and off-the-shelf materials with complex CNC joinery? That was one thing. The second thing, what I was really interested in, robotic 3D printing. So how can I built with students our own Endam tool to do clay 3D printing and research what does it actually mean to work with materials such as clay, and how can we rethink how we design architecture if we have an entirely different process of producing it. And the third thing which I find really interesting, which we have started in the core studio 1 year ago, where we started working with the students a lot with paper. This came also hand in hand with the pandemic and remote teaching. We looked at what are the resources which are immediately available to the students when they are kind of spread across the world. And we looked into paper folding techniques and curved folding techniques and kind of the material properties of paper and how to translate those material properties into digital design processes. So a lot of the work is very physical prototyping focused and then directly fed into what kind of computational techniques do you use to simulate some of these processes. And that is something which we most likely going to continue focusing with Core Studio this year as well. And I'm excited to see what the students are coming up with. Certainly, I think that the difficulty of becoming a licensed architect is a challenge, especially if you want to at the same time be a young and progressive design firm which does experimental design. So in Austria, it is similar. Like when you graduate, you have to work for 3 years as a professional architect in an architectural office before you can become a civil engineer, which allows you then to stamp drawings. So I think that it is quite similar in Austria actually as it is here. I never studied in the United States, so I don't have an experience from a perspective of a student, but one thing what was always a drive in my work, in whatever I did, was I really wanted to do what I enjoyed doing. So I really wanted to create designs which are not limiting me in any way. So kind of I found the medium which allows me that. And I wasn't interested to have constraints on my design purely in order to be able to build. So I really went totally the opposite direction. I was like, I really want to create amazing designs. I really want to push all the boundaries I can on the digital side. And I don't want to limit myself ever to constraints which are coming from building codes or from limitations in terms of like getting a license and so on. So that was always out of the question for me. At the same time, my partner, Kai Salravi, who studied with me at the Architectural Association, he went into the large scale. And so he really focused on facade engineering. And so he did all the processes. He does all the processes I'm doing on the small scale on the very large scale. And he got his license last year, or I think 2 years ago. He became a licensed architect here. And so in the future, if we are interested in kind of producing something together, we might be able to work together in that sense. But I certainly agree that it is a challenge, and I think that the schools also need to focus more on it. I mean, one great thing about the graduate program at UCLA is that it is a NAB accredited program, and so our students come out of the school and they get a NAB accredited degree, and then they also have certain classes which already kind of prepare them for some of this. One of the hardest things to learn as a designer for me was that I get very excited about projects and ideas, and I like to put a lot of time and effort into projects, and I never really thought of securing my ideas in any kind of way or making sure that I don't produce a lot of IP for other people. And when I realized that some people exploited that in a very harsh way, I realized what it actually means to be a creative and to have talent. And we architects, we do have a lot of talent. And we get very excited about projects, and we very quickly start with the artistic work and neglect some of the other parts, may it be the business side or the legal parts and so on. And that was really something, as a creative person, I learned it almost like a really hard way. But at the same time, I was thankful for this learning experience because it kind of prepared me for much bigger projects. And I then approached the bigger projects in a very different way and became much more aware of what kind of talent we have. And so one thing what I teach my students and anyone who works with me is to always make sure to know the value of your work and to really, I never had anyone work with me for free. So because I totally don't believe that, I think I also don't produce any work for free because I don't think that architectural work or designers should work for free. But there is a general perception out there, what I know from colleagues of mine and so on, which takes that as a basis. And that is maybe also one reason why I do a lot of work in other disciplines, because I find work there which, in a way, as I mentioned earlier, fund my research, and so they allow me to do work and also make money of it. And so I think that we as architects, we really have to, I think, sometimes rethink our profession a little bit and think about how can we almost design like architecture as products in order to also be able to not repeat every single step over and over and over again. Whenever there's a new project come, we start from zero, right? And so I think that if we can kind of teach ourselves and the future of architects in that way, that they can kind of think about different pathways in architecture, that would be, I think, an interesting thing to do. And towards your second question, one thing what I would really like to do is I would really like to scale up some of my ideas. So I would really like to work on some kind of larger scale architectural project where I can implement some of those design aesthetics which I designed on the smaller scale products and fashion designs.